All right, guys, I think we're going to get started. Can you all hear me okay? Am I being mic'd? Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here today. I am looking forward to having a conversation about implementation science at Penn with these great legends to my left. I think maybe to start, I'm going to ask each of you guys to introduce yourself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Werner. I'm the executive director of LDI, and I've learned a lot about implementation science from these folks. So Meghan, do you want to go?
Sure. So, hi, everybody. I'm Meghan Lane-Fall. I'm the executive director of the Penn Implementation Science Center at the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics, also known as PISCE at LDI. And I'm a physician scientist who has an appointment in anesthesia and then a secondary appointment in epidemiology.
Hi.
Is that working?
Yeah, just hold it a little closer.
Okay. Hi, I'm Karen Glanz. I'm a George Weiss professor in the schools of medicine and nursing here at Penn, and I'm a social scientist, public healther by background.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Kimberly, and I'm an emeritus professor at the Wharton School. And at Wharton, I was in both the management department and the Department of Management and Health Economics, and have been a longtime observer of and involver in implementation science at Penn.
Okay, thank you. So we have a pretty small group here today. Our goal is to talk about the past, present, and future of implementation science here at Penn. And because it's a small group, I'm just going to say that if you guys have questions as we go along, please raise your hand. We'd love to have a conversation with all of you rather than us sitting up here and talking to you. But to kick things off, I think, John, I'm going to turn to you. And I'd love to hear, I know a little bit about the history of implementation science at Penn, but tell us how it all started.
How it all started? So actually it all started a number of years ago when a new hire at Penn, an MD, PhD named Ezekiel Emanuel, some of you may have heard of him, he organized, when he just arrived at Penn, he organized a retreat, an on-campus retreat, and invited the entire Penn community to come. Well, the auditorium was full, and Zeke was sort of introducing himself and talking about what some of his aspirations were for his time at Penn. And then he asked the audience to volunteer to put out any ideas they have about initiatives, new initiatives that could be undertaken. And so there were 3 or 4 people who stood up and gave their thoughts and their ideas. And I was sitting in the very back row of this auditorium. And there was a person, and these are names you may want to just jot down and check who they are. But I was sitting next to, on my left, was a physician named Josh Metley, who has since left Penn and has gone a little farther north. And then on my right was a woman named Joanne Levy, who at the time was very involved in the Leonard Davis Institute as sort of co-director. And so as these people were standing up and giving their thoughts to Zeke about what might be, the big idea that they had, I leaned over to Joanne and I said, Joanne, I think we have, there was some light bulb went off. And I said, Joanne, we could really do something here in implementation if we, if I don't know if this is a big enough idea for Zeke, but I may try it out. And then I leaned over to Josh and said to Josh, Josh, what do you think? And he said, I don't know. Going public with that may or may not be a good idea. So anyhow, Joanne finally convinced me to stand up. So I said to Zeke and to the crowd there, I said, I think Penn has an opportunity here to really do something special, different, innovative, and it will pull together a lot of the different capabilities that the Penn faculty has. And it's all around implementation. And if we did it right, if we had enough sort of vision and then could bring the resources behind the vision to make it happen, we could really become a leading institution in implementation. Sat down. The room was, of course, silent. There was no applause or anything. So then there was a break. And so I was sitting there in the back row still. All of a sudden, I feel this hand on my shoulder, and I look up, and it's Zeke. And so Zeke said, who are you? And I said, well, my name is John Kimberly. And he said, can we talk? So at that moment, I said, sure, let's do it. You know, I think for me, that was the beginning of an initiative at Penn that has really exploded. What Zeke did was he created a number of working groups. I think there were 5 working groups that he created as a consequence of that retreat, ideas that came up, one of which was implementation. That working group, he provided some seed funding for, and the working group got off the ground and solicited grant proposals from people to spend the money that Zeke had put out there. He was really it was seed money to try to get some things started, new initiatives started at Penn. So I think that's probably enough. That was, at least in my view, now everybody's view of history probably is a little different, but that's my view of how things sort of got started here, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. I remember that retreat very well. I have to say, I don't remember you standing up and saying that.
When was the retreat?
Well, I was an assistant professor. I had little kids at the time.
Around 2011-ish. Probably around 2011. I'd probably been here a couple of years by then.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and Josh was still here.
Yeah, because Dan had, I guess Joanne's not here, but Dan had just started as executive director of LDI. And so you were at the retreat, Karen?
I was at the retreat. I probably said to John, good idea. John and I had met a little bit before that. We were just talking about how we met through a small work group, and I was equally wondering who is he, as he was wondering who I was. But when we both said things that sounded like they were on the money and that we knew what we were talking about, we started to have a conversation. And so I joined John in co-leading that implementation science working group. We, as he said, resources were modest, so we looked to get out some pilot grants. We held a conference that was quite well attended in the basement of one of the Wharton buildings. And we were also looking for opportunities to cross over to the health system, both of us being non-clinicians. And they were met with lukewarm reception. The one quote that was most memorable to me at the time was, "We don't want a bunch of researchers telling us what to do in the health system."
The health system.
This predates the Center for Healthcare Innovation, predates much of what we all are very familiar with these days. So those were what we should call them the dark ages of implementation science.
Yeah, sure.
Here at Penn.
And so can I just ask a question? Were those the dark ages of implementation science just here at Penn, or nationally? Like, what was happening in the landscape? Because implementation science is new as a discipline.
I would say that nationally, implementation science was planting its roots at about that time. I, like John, had been working in research related to implementation science for quite a number of years before. We called it things like diffusion of innovations, dissemination, and the jargon was changing, and a new generation was starting to come up. And that's probably when we should hand it off to Meghan.
Yes, we should. Meghan.
So
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to just add a little thing to your question, Rachel. So what was going on outside Penn at that time? And the journal Implementation Science was actually founded. The first issue was published in 2006.
Yeah. Right.
So, you know, all of a sudden, it wasn't as though we were on the very leading edge here. And I had no clue as to what was going on in that world at that time. But so Implementation Science Journal was started in 2006. The D&I conferences started, I think the first one was in 2007. So there was some beginning of momentum building on which we capitalized, I think.
Okay, that's helpful. So Megan, do you remember the retreat?
I wasn't at the retreat. I was a clinical fellow.
So tell us how you got involved in this.
So I took a class in implementation science in 2013, which is the end of my time in the Master's in Science and Health Policy Research. And John Kimberly was one of the instructors in that class that was also taught by Renad Betis, whose name I'm sure will come up again, who's my predecessor and partner in crime for a very long time. And I had to write a final project for that class, trying to understand how to bridge the evidence to practice gap. So for the uninitiated, implementation science, my favorite definition of it is the science of human behavior change under organizational constraints. And so the idea is that you're trying to bridge the evidence to practice gap, and you're using all of the knowledge that we have from org theory and community engaged research, public health, psychology, sociology, any social science that has to do with behavior change at any level, and you're trying to put it all together to get folks to do what they're supposed to be doing. So I had to write a final project, and I said, I don't know what the evidence looks like in anesthesia, but I know about handoffs, or transitions of patient care, and so I'm gonna write about that. Thought it was a harebrained idea, took it to John, and he said, this sounds really interesting. And I went, this Wharton professor thinks this thing is interesting. Okay, I guess I'll do something with that. Turned that final project into a grant, which then got funded, and said, okay, I guess maybe this is a thing. And then we were off to the races. So that's how I got into implementation science and started teaching it in, I want to say maybe 2016 with Renad.
And so your formal training in implementation science was a class with John?
That's most of it. I did actually, so, as John alluded to, there's a lot of energy in implementation science outside the institution. And so NHLDI, which is one of the many institutes at the NIH, invested in what they called the PRIDE program, which is research programs to improve representation from historically underrepresented groups, and one of those is focused on implementation science. So I did also take that program, which is based at UCSF, and went through some training with them as well. But mostly it was that class.
Okay, so John and Karen can probably take credit for a lot of careers in implementation science at this point. So Megan, as you all know, is now the leader of implementation science here at Penn. And I want to get to your vision, so where we are and where you want to go. But before we do that, I might actually ask John and Karen to think about, like, back in 2011, when this was all started, what was your vision?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, because I have a memo here. I did a deep dive.
I did research for this.
I did a deep dive. So this is dated September 26, 2011. And it was a memo to the woman on my right here saying, and I'll be brief with this, here's some thoughts about what we might propose. Enhancing impact, focusing on implementation science. There are lots of researchers at Penn, many of whom are senior fellows at LDI, doing important work, the implications of which are substantial. But for a variety of reasons, the impact of their research is frequently less than it could be. Because one, they are not really interested in implementation. Two, they're on to the next grant and don't have time to think about implementation. And three, they do not incorporate what is known about the science of implementation into their research designs. Or four, they're unaware of how much is known about implementation in the first place. We propose a new initiative at Penn to promote cross-school and cross-disciplinary exploration of the art and science, and both of those are important, art as well as science, of implementation. We see enormous potential to build a hub at Penn that will focus on what is known and what has been experienced but not yet codified about implementation. We believe that such a hub can be a valuable resource for researchers across the university, and if done well, can become a nationally significant initiative. That was sort of 2011. That was a while ago.
Thanks. And Karen, what do you think when you got that memo from John?
Karen wrote back, it's a terrible idea.
I thought he keeps better email files than I do. I don't know what that would be filed under. I think we had talked and we saw potential, and I kind of agreed that there were a lot of people around the edges of implementation science who could be energized and we could get together. But we faced a lot of challenges. I think some of the other working groups were things like, health insurance policy, that were like really straightforward, had their place, had their experts. And we really had to create that. And we had modest resources, high motivation, but also being pulled in a lot of other directions. So I think, we took things forward. There were two fairly junior faculty at the time, Ian Bennett, who is a family medicine doc, and Renaud Batis, who at the time was a brand newly minted assistant professor. They had a ton of energy, and we got them involved, and what was it, 2-3 years later, we passed the baton.
Yeah, we passed the baton.
And I would say that's when it was a new era at Penn. There was a Center for Healthcare Innovation, a nudge unit, electronic health records were getting to be a common part of real-time research, I would say, not just study them to look for patterns of care or patterns of use of health services. And they ran with it and took it, and I think that made things, was a real turning point.
And so, Meghan, maybe you can reflect a little bit on where you think implementation science at Penn is today, and then we can also get to your vision for the future.
So, spurred on in part by that energy from the folks that started the implementation science working group and then took it over, but also really helped along by a national community of folks and a lot of investment from the NIH, implementation science has grown both locally and nationally. So now we have a grant portfolio that's in excess of $50 million of all the folks that are doing work related to implementation. There are a camp of folks that do what I would call implementation practice, which is taking what we know and applying it to lots of different areas, and it's really exciting to see the movement in that space. And then a smaller group of folks who are focused on advancing the methodology around implementation. So whether that's new statistical methodologies, new qualitative methodologies, or trying to understand complexity science. There's a group of folks that are trying to push the envelope there, but it's a pretty thriving community. And a lot of folks that are relatively on the younger end trying to get into it as well. And so training and capacity building is a big part of what we do now too.
And if you reflect across, reflect on implementation science across the university, there's obviously a lot here in the medical school. Where else is it happening?
So we're seeing a lot in nursing, and it's really exciting to see that too. Amanda Betancourt is our director of acute care implementation research in the center, but she's a faculty member in the School of Nursing along with Katie Hoskins, and there are a bunch of other folks getting into it too. We're seeing a lot of energy in social policy and practice. And then some sort of rumblings in other areas. So we're talking to some folks who are doing environmental research, vet school, dental school, have had some conversations. So there's increasing interest across the university.
And what about interest from within operations? So John mentioned that back in the early days of the working group, people within the health system were skeptical about incorporating science. How is the reception, do you think, now? I can ask any of you three can answer that.
Well, I think the reception now is enormous. And I think I can't say, I don't know what it is at all universities with health systems, but I think it's uniquely supportive. A lot of it comes under the broad heading of innovation. I'm working on a grant proposal that's due tomorrow with Meghan and a breast cancer surgeon. And one of the implementation strategies that we figured we need to do if we really want to get this strategy for older adult cancer patients to be communicating better with their providers is we need to, one of our outcomes is documentation, electronic health record. And so our collaborator, her name is Lola Fayanju, some of you will know her, and she said, well, we'll just have to change the way the electronic health record is set up so that it's easier and it doesn't have to be done in free text. And that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, but now it's pretty straightforward and feasible. So I think that we've come such a long way, and I think Penn, the UPenn health system, and CHOP, I should say, as well, have been very, very supportive and in it with us.
I think the relationship between implementation scientists and the health system is a complicated one. And I think there's a lot of support conceptually and a lot of support for EHR-related things. There is a tension between the timelines that we tend to take for research and the timelines, sort of normal operational timelines. And I see some of our health system folks nodding here. And so that tension, I think we're still trying to navigate. And I also perceive implementation scientists need to prove themselves a little bit, because when I talk to health system folks, there's oh, that sounds interesting, but do we really need you? Like, we're kind of already doing fine with really robust quality improvement, performance improvement, all of these other mechanisms. And so I think implementation scientists need to prove their value sort of in a time scale that makes sense to health system partners to really accelerate what we're doing.
Yeah, I do want to add one other thing. Is one area, broad area that I work in is implementation in communities and also in community organizations. My biggest study, I think it actually was one of the first large R01s from NIH, from the National Cancer Institute, to do implementation, called diffusion at the time, was in swimming pools in the community. We have 400 swimming pools across the country in our study. And so I think it's important to remember, and it's also an important opportunity for implementation science, not just in health systems or in healthcare delivery, but also in the community.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little more what's going on at Penn related to community-engaged research and the overlap with implementation science agenda here at Penn?
Wow, I can tell you a little, but it won't cover the ground. And this is another area that I think has exploded in the last decade or so. I've been doing community-engaged research as long as I can remember. When I came to Penn, there were maybe a small handful of people doing community-engaged research, somewhat under the rubric of health disparities. There wasn't much. A woman who some of you may know or know of, Shanita Hughes-Halbert, was leading the community engagement core of the institutional CTSA, which is ITMAT. And it was a kind of an outlier because we didn't have a piece of equipment that we could offer to people to use for their research. And so the core, as she led it, held seminars and offered some pilot grants, et cetera. And my then department chair, Brian Strom, was kind of over the human side of the CTSA resources and knew my background. I had been doing that kind of thing at Emory with the Georgia CTSA, and he asked me to be part of it. And as it turned out, when Shanita left for a better opportunity somewhere else, I became the head of that, and so have been leading that for now about 10 years. Kevin Volp came on board about 1 or 2 funding cycles ago, I think about 5 years ago. So behavioral economics and community engaged research kind of got engaged or started dating there. But now you can't look in any direction and not stumble across community engaged research at Penn. I mean, there are enormous numbers of people with activities going on in the community and with funded research really tackling things like structural racism, poverty, and this goes well beyond medicine, Wharton, arts and sciences, and so forth. And it's fantastic to see all that going on.
Maybe, Meghan, I can turn to you and you can talk a little bit about what's going on at PISCE LDI, and would love to hear a little bit about your goals and vision for the future there.
So right now, the center is focused on building and sustaining a community of folks who are interested in implementation, research, and practice, and we've done that pretty effectively with seminars and with works in progress sessions, and we send out a newsletter. We also have a huge focus on training and capacity building. So we have a 4-day implementation science boot camp called the Implementation Science Institute that we just delivered this last June for the 7th time. All told, between the ISI and our various classes, we've trained more than 700 people at this point. at Penn and nationally and globally, actually, which is great. So those are our really key areas. And then we have a couple of strategic partnerships that we're focusing on for this year. One is with the Center for AIDS Research, because there's an increasing focus on uptake of evidence-based practice in service of ending the HIV epidemic and getting more evidence-based interventions like pre-exposure prophylaxis into practice. And then the other is with CHOP and with the Clinical Futures Program, which used to have another name. I forget what the name was, but there's a lot of appetite at CHOP for using implementation science approaches and improving care. So we're really excited about all of those things. I would say moving forward, I want to see us branch outside the School of Medicine a little bit more. And there's a lot of energy from the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, looking at climate change and environmental health, which a lot of our collaborators in other parts of the university know a lot about. And so I would love to see us move in that direction. I'd love to see us do more with education, social policy, and practice. And so I'm hoping that we can branch out a little bit, preserve our healthcare roots and our, focus on population health, but also kind of move in those other directions too.
And John, maybe I'll pull you into this conversation. Could you reflect a little bit on where you see the biggest opportunities for implementation science moving forward?
That's a good question, and I have sort of we haven't talked about this, Megan, but
I know. This is your feedback.
Okay.
So it's really interesting, and I wish I knew more about you as an audience, so I know exactly what you're interested in, how to pitch what I have to say. But I think implementation science has sort of reached a bit of a tipping point, and I'm thinking about particularly writing grant proposals, whereas before it reached the tipping point, the question was, I think, why would you want to do that? That is put in a section on implementation science in your grant proposal. It hits the tipping point where if you don't have something in about implementation science, that's a strike against you. And I think I can't pinpoint temporally exactly when we reach that tipping point, but it's happened. And so that has, I think, some real positive, exciting implications. And, there's another side to it potentially, if we're not careful, that may raise its ugly head as well. And that is where, when you think about what it takes to write an effective grant proposal, what you obviously want to make sure you do is check all the boxes, right, that you anticipate the reviewers are going to be looking at. And my worry at this point, to the extent that I should reveal personal concerns here, but my worry is that there may be a tendency to have a sort of a check-the-box approach to implementation science without really understanding what the fundamental questions are that you're trying to address with including implementation as a part of the grant proposal. So that's a potential downside that I see. The upsides are, I think, also they're probably stronger. Hopefully they're stronger. But at the end of the day, the fundamental question is, how do you get new ideas, new approaches, new technologies, whatever, how do you get them from the bench, from the researcher's bench, into practice, right? How do you do that? And there is clearly a scientific component to that. And there's also another component, I don't know what label to put on it. One label might be art. Another label might be soft science. So I think when Rachel asked the question about going forward, what do you see? I see a huge upside, but I think we have to be a little careful about how we move forward.
And so could you just reflect a little more on what it would take to move forward successfully given those potential challenges?
So, yeah, is that a question?
I was going to ask a question, but I can wait for you to. It doesn't matter. Do you want to go?
Okay, let me try to answer Rachel's question because it's a good one.
You said it was okay to just ask.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. And actually, I was about to remind you all to ask questions, so we'll take your question in just one sec.
So back up and could you reformulate the question?
What would it take to move forward, given the, yeah.
Yeah. How would you solve that problem?
Yep.
I think there are two problems. I think there are two related problems here, or let me put it there, two related challenges, which we have to think creatively about how to resolve, right? One is the challenge of moving the needle on the way practicing clinicians think about the importance of implementation, clinicians/researchers. You know, to the extent that it's viewed as something that's sort of an add-on, and you don't really have to take too seriously, but you sort of have to do the dance. I think that's a potential danger. So I think the real challenge here is the challenge of changing mindsets, changing the mindsets of people who have distinguished records and reputations in clinical science, being terrific clinical scientists, and helping move the needle on their thinking about the importance of taking what they think they discovered and moving to the next step. What implications does this have at the bedside of the patient? And this is an issue that goes back in history, I mean, way back. NIH has been often asked, you know, how does all this money that we spend, that the research that you're sponsoring, how does all that, what impact does that research have? You know, to what extent does it end up at, you know, moving the needle on care and improving care? And that's a serious question. So I think demonstrating the way in which clinical researchers think about their research, and I guess there's a question that I have, and that's the connection between what we're talking about here with implementation science and translational medicine, which is, you know, another translational medicine has a very similar kind of issue that it's trying to solve, as I understand it, right? And I think Penn right now is in the midst of, Penn Medicine is in the midst of trying to figure out, you know, answers, strategies for answering the question of sort of how do we motivate researchers to think more deeply about and seriously about the next stage. Once the research is done, how do you move it into the world of practice? So let me stop there. I could go on for a long time on this. I feel deeply about it, but I'm a little reluctant to do that.
Well, we may return to this, but why don't we take some questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Thank you. And actually, that was exactly where my question was headed. So my name's Julie Jablonski, and I'm not a researcher, but I'm...
It's okay.
But I work very much in the space of evidence-based practice and translation of evidence. And so I love this space of implementation science, but, and Meghan really pinpointed that there's this timeline pressure in real practice. So I guess what I'm kind of asking is, so if I want to find a clinical solution, I'm looking for an answer, I look at the evidence, I do an evidence review, and it points me to what is the thing I should try to implement. And then of course, we spend a ton of time coming up with pathways and clinical, and then finally, and that could take a year sometimes, and then someone's like, okay, implement it. And we don't give enough time and attention. That implementation can take just as long as all of the planning and prep, but there's really, and I mean, do you think we just try to, is that what it is? It's just the timeline is different, that we're in a healthcare organization that wants something much quicker, and I don't know, because I live this world of, okay, implement it, and I do my best to implement, but the expectation is to have the outcome in, say, a month, when if you do a rigorous implementation science study, I mean, you're doing qualitative, you are doing what is supposed to be done, but in real life, there's no patience to do, I need to do focus groups in 2 weeks, come up with themes, change the medical record, and then go. You know what I mean? So anyway, I know that's a loaded question, but just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
And actually, I might push on that. It's a great question, and I often wonder the same thing, which is how do we make research happen faster? And I'm often trying to push researchers, I feel like, to make it happen faster and get a lot of flack for that. So what do you guys think?
So it's a perfect question, and I do think things need to happen faster. I guess one thing that comes up for me is there a scientific question? Because if there's not a scientific question, then I think we can apply what we know and do it really quickly. And I think implementation science can give us some tools so we can talk about contextual inquiry and do a few focus groups or maybe a survey or look at artifacts. Like, I think there's a way to do that relatively quickly. And some of the innovation in the field around rapid qualitative inquiry, rapid ethnographic inquiry can allow us to do that. So I think there may actually be a place for using some of the tools from implementation science and applying them in a reasonable timeline. But if there's an actual scientific question, then I think sometimes we do have to slow down. And I think some of the work that I've done around handoffs, one of the reasons I could do it is because it wasn't really on anybody's list of things. And so they gave me time and they're like, whatever, if it takes a couple years, like, sure, that's fine. But I do think you have to sort of come down on what is the thing you're trying to do. Is this an operational goal or is this a research goal? And that can give you some guidance.
Yeah, one of the things that this discussion, and it started when John was talking, but it circles back to this whole issue of how long do things take to get implemented. There's the kind of the classic pipeline that says it takes 7 years from a discovery to its being well or widely implemented. And that's really bothering me a lot lately because we have so much technology that we didn't have when that article was written 20, 25, 30 years ago. We have technology in healthcare, we have communication technology, we have clinical, support technology. One generation or 2 generations behind us, everybody has this little computer that they hold on to. When I was in graduate school, I had a colleague who thought Newton was the answer, and that everybody was going to have a little Newton thing, and we were all like, "You're really fantasizing." But it didn't turn out to be Newton. But we've all got iPhones, and so why isn't it faster? And it's the bench to bedside to community to populations even. And one of the nagging questions that I have is, somebody needs to take a closer look at what that really is now, because I don't believe, some of that came from new drugs and new treatments, that they took that long to be adopted into practice. Now, not a physician, but have one in the family, and I know how quickly they have to keep up and how many tools there are to keep up with. No, not everybody needs a stress test because because their blood pressure is high or they're going on a statin or something like that. But there's still people out there who think that. And if you pick up an article from 5-6 years ago, you'll find something that says that. So I think that's something that really needs some great minds to be wrapped around. And if anybody wants to take on that project, I'd love to be a part of it.
I also think that I'd love to see us think about implementation at the very beginning. And that's another thing that comes up for me. So as you're thinking about that pathway, is there someone on the team who has implementation in mind, who's thinking, is this an implementable pathway? That, I hope, would sort of shorten some of those timelines too, but I often see implementation considered at the very end, maybe even after somebody's tried to do something like, oh, well, we did training and we built a knowledge link and we did this and it didn't work. And then they come back and they go, now what's wrong?
So let me take a swing at your question, which I think is a great question. I feel your pain. And so I think there's a real interesting issue here when you think about the potential implications of artificial intelligence. When artificial intelligence enters the arena, and it's entering at a very rapid rate, as we know, I think what AI can probably do is speed up the research process. I think it's going to not be quite as effective in speeding up implementation. And I'll tell you why, and you can agree or disagree. But I think implementation is a lot about behavior change. It's about intervening in a system which has routines and habits and so on, and in some ways disrupting them or changing them. And whenever you do that, some people win, some people lose. You just can't push the implementation button and make it happen, because behavior change is at the center of it, I think. So I think, and I'm not sure this is answering your question directly, but I think on the research side, I think AI can speed things up a lot, and we've already seen examples of that. I think on the implementation side, it's less obvious to me what the potential there is.
There's a question in the middle here, and then Nancy.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to learn more about this work. I'm a newbie. And so I'm thinking, so I don't exactly know how it works when it comes to community-based, you mentioned, Karen. So, my question is, if I'm a community-based organization, we have a challenge, and does it work that that group can come to the center and work out a project? How does that work?
That's really a great question and a great challenge as to how we connect with, whether it's community or healthcare practitioners, clinicians, what have you. There are pathways to it, but I think like connecting with anyone, like, for instance, I often get letters from students from anywhere in the world that want to come and study here, or want a postdoc with me, or want advice on their thesis, even because they know that I wrote something about something like what they're doing. And one of my first immediate reactions on that is, where's their professor in this? I bet I might even know their professor if they're from, a well-known institution. So it's kind of art and science. It's part of finding one's way to people who know someone who might be interested in that, and have a path. I think whether that path is funding, interest, student projects, et cetera. I think there are a lot of different entry points. I think it also depends on, what are the policies, resources, and structures of the organization. For very small community organizations, we have an annual activity called Community Driven Research Day that's been held for 10 or 15 years, that matches up people from small, often low-resourced organizations with university faculty, and some of those turn out to be very productive partnerships. But in other cases, there will be large organizations like, PHMC, American Cancer Society, Philly Fights, there's just tons of them. And they have a lot of resources and they have staff. And so in that case, I think they may have the wherewithal to do some kind of implementation and might want to use university faculty as either partners or consultants. So there are a lot of different entry points there.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think it's worth us rethinking our relationship to communities and community groups, because a lot of the energy or the research or the knowledge goes one direction. And I think at places like Penn, we haven't historically acknowledged that there's a lot of experience and expertise that can come from the community and that we need to partner. But it is through relationships. There's not an easy mechanism that I can see for any community group to just say, I have an idea, let me go to Penn and see if someone will help me with it. There are programs like what Karen mentioned. There's the Community Scholars Program that is run by Sarah Solomon and Nikki Thomas. There's Accelerate Health Equity, which is funded by Independence Blue Cross. That's a cross-health system partnership where community groups can interact in lots of different ways. So there are ways, but I think it's not as easy as it ought to be for that partnership to emerge and for us to learn from each other.
To pick up on the comment about the risk-based in the field and build on your question too, I guess it's about selecting the thing and the level of evidence needed for that thing to move forward. I see it in the area I'm in, which is in dementia caregiving, and systematic reviews that have shown that a lot of the interventions are just not ready perhaps for implementation yet. They've been rigorously tested in multiple trials. And it's because they're very complex, they're multi-level. It takes a while to make these things happen. And so I guess that's the other challenge I think facing the field is when is something ready for implementation and recognizing that these are complex problems and the solutions are complex. So I don't know if it's just a point of like for your edification or if you could comment on that.
I think that's spot on. But I think it's a question from where I sit today, just because I have a big grant due tomorrow that has the core research project that has to be implementation science that we've asked you to be an advisor on if we get funded. And, the funder, which is Centers for Disease Control, says you have to implement an evidence-based intervention. And the team of us get together and said, well, what shall we do? Oh, they also gave us 17 topics, and we had to fit what we're doing into one of those topics. And, it's what is enough evidence? So we're proposing a two-part intervention and proposing to blend it, which hasn't been done before, for older adult cancer patients. And for one part of the intervention, comprehensive geriatric assessment, there's a huge body of research, Cochrane reviews, meta-analyses, systematic reviews. For the other thing, which is called the best case, worst case, provider communication when patients get diagnosed, there's a handful of pilot studies. And yet it's considered a good practice, written up in respectable journals. So our task was kind of to make the case. One of the things is that the best case, worst case had not been tried in diverse populations, and we felt that was essential. So it's, I think, going back to what John said, it's art as much as it is science. I think creativity in intervention strategies is, not talked about enough. But I think the way one tells a story about something being evidence-based and what are the evidence gaps that can be tackled is, is like weaving, I guess.
I think this is a critical question for the field, and I worry a little bit about us doing too much gatekeeping. And often when I teach implementation science, I'll say the price of entry is that you have an evidence-based practice. Like, you don't get to play in the sandbox unless you have an evidence-based practice. But the more we exclude folks, the more we I think we do that at our peril, basically. So some of the things that I think about have to do with if there's a tension for change. So if there's a group of stakeholders that says, even though there aren't multiple randomized controlled trials, it's time to move forward, and here's why. I think that's part of it. And you see groups like the American Cancer Society or AARP or whoever say, we're ready for this thing. Health systems, I think, have a lot to say in this. So sometimes health systems will say, we're going to do this thing. And that can provide enough room for an implementation scientist to say, well, it's happening anyway, let's go ahead and study it. But also, I think we need to consider the risk-benefit ratio of the intervention itself. And for interventions that are relatively low risk, what's the harm, right? Like, if you're doing something that has a mechanistic rationale behind it, it's more likely to benefit than harm. Maybe there's no risk of harm at all. Then I think the decision around implementation readiness looks a little different than if it's a drug that's, in phase 1 trials. But I don't think that we have had that conversation in such a nuanced way, but it's a really crucial one.
I want to just point out and refer people to a resource that they may not be aware of. I spent 10 years on the Community Preventive Services Task Force, which is also known as the Community Guide. And we kind of think of ourselves, it's run by the CDC, it's federal volunteer task force members staffed by federal employees. And we took on the issues of implementation in the community, whereas the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force looks at clinical implementation. But for the Community Guide, and the methodology that we used was what is enough evidence to make a recommendation. And in some cases, I'll use an example of something I studied, which was skin cancer prevention in recreation settings, that's those swimming pools. We did pilot studies, we did an RCT, and then we did a diffusion, dissemination, implementation trial in 400 sites. It actually met the bar by having, in the middle there, before the dissemination study was done, by having one strong RCT. So there are different levels that you can look at in that body of evidence, or it can be a collection of quasi-experiments and observational studies. And so, I mean, if anybody's interested, look into the methodology publications for the community guide that are online.
So we have time for one more question, unless you guys want to just give short answers. Questions in the back.
Yeah, I think you have the wrong panel.
I know. Yeah, Pat, do you want to start?
Sure, I hope it's worthy enough to be one of the last the pressure is on. I'm wondering, I'm a believer in shamelessly stealing, and I just wonder if there's a health system out there on the, on the operations side that has really sort of partnered in a really significant way with, the academic, implementation science, because it feels like we just need to figure out how to get started, and it would be helpful, because otherwise, if there's always something else to do, right? Something else to do. I just wonder if there, what else is out there. I mean, or are we just at the forefront here?
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to want to hear this, but we're pretty good. We're pretty close in terms of being at the forefront of incorporating implementation science into what we do. Geisinger does this too. So they have a very robust program around the detection and treatment of familial hypercholesterolemia and cascade testing, and they've done a lot in their electronic medical record to pull that in. Kaiser, that's true. Oh, the VA. The VA is the 800-pound gorilla in here, in this room, and we've got some VA folks here. They're actually way ahead. So if you don't count the VA, but you should.
If I don't do clinical, like disease specific stuff, like operational, big organizational change projects, something, that's what I find where I feel that it's not, we could be doing more.
Are there examples of learning health systems that have really successfully integrated implementation science into them? Because most of them are more about like the intervention
I
and
think
like
Kaiser
tinkering.
would probably be, although Kaiser varies a lot, there are different regions. But part of the reason that Kaiser Permanente does so well is that they're a staff model healthcare system. And so if they say, this is how we're reminding people to get their mammograms, they just go ahead and implement it. They don't say, would you be interested in implementing this? If we motivate you, if we incentivize you, if we show you.
So I think that's a key question, and thinking about not just which health systems do this, but what are the characteristics of those health systems, because the incentives are so different. And I think, Karen, your point about those health systems that have staff employees, they have different levers than health systems like ours.
And there are gobs of studies of trying to give physicians incentives to increase the percentage of their age-appropriate patients that get certain screenings. And guess what? Most of them don't work, because at the end of the year, if someone's going to give you $1,000 for a calculation that you never would have done anyway, it somehow doesn't.
Disconnect, yeah.
So I have to add a little something here. I think, what we're talking about is basically organizational change. And how you introduce organizational change effectively. And you can do it by fiat. Somebody at the top of the organization can say, this is the way it's going to be. And then, we'll see what happens that way. You can think about it from the bottom up, from the middle out. I mean, I think what I see here, and it's a fascinating world, is the clash between two different thought worlds. It's the sort of the medical research thought world and the, for lack of a better term, the managerial change thought world. And I think those worlds are beginning to approach each other now. And I think the kind of work that Meghan and PISCE have been doing and are doing is helping that. But I think we've got a ways to go. And to try to answer the question that you asked, which is a good one, is, I think that's where I see the potential, is in bringing the thought worlds closer together. I think there are probably some ways to do that, but I don't think until that happens, that divide is going to be crossed.
So Megan, I want to, we have 1 minute, and I want to give you, what depends on the clock, there's 2 minutes on that one. So, I would love to turn to you for concluding thoughts.
Concluding thoughts are that the future of implementation science is bright at Penn and outside the institution. There's some really important tensions that we've brought up that we have to deal with, but I think that we're up to the task. I do think that the bigger we can make the umbrella, the better. More ideas, more people, less gatekeeping. Sometimes our jargon can turn people off. So I think one of the challenges moving forward is just trying to bring more people in, more ideas, and innovate together to achieve the change we want to see.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to all of our panelists, and I hope you join me in.
So, Karen.
And so there's lunch out in the lobby, and I hope that you'll join us for lunch and mingle.
But here it is, Karen Glanz.